Abattnoir. Written by David James. Read by Sarah Millican.
Sweet little Clara Winkleface was finding life tough. She had no friends or family. Her mother was killed in a freak accident involving a frisbee, and she'd lived her life in K. What money she'd inherited, she'd unwisely donated to good-looking men in Africa seeking marriage and financial assistance. Desperate for cash and unlucky in love, she'd been struggling to find both in the dead-end town she called home. But everything was about to change for Clara Winkleface. As she had no qualifications to her rather unfortunate name, she applied for an apprenticeship at Mervyn's Micro Abattoir, and surprisingly was thrown a lifeline. Under the watchful eye of Mervyn's assistant Selwyn, or Slicer as he was fondly known, she would learn the necessary skills, drum up new business and keep the bailiffs at bay. Poor Mervyn needed to be with his mother, who was dying in hospital in Crewe, so after showing Clara the ropes, or some quite nasty business with a rather large knife, he left her in Selwyn's dutiful care for the week. Selwyn made Clara anxious, because he looked like a cross between Fungus the Bogeyman and Mrs. Mangle from Neighbours. She tried not to think about this as he flashed her an unnerving smile, handed her a 15-inch blade and pushed her towards her first cow. "All right, treacle tits, let's see what you're made of," said Selwyn. Clara paused. "I'm not sure I can, not when she's looking at me like that." So Selwyn deftly pushed both thumbs deep into the cow's pupils and extracted them in one foul plop. "Better?" Selwyn sucked both eyeballs from his bloody thumbs and swallowed. "Now, Slicer, that squealing's getting on my nerves." Clara ran from the room in floods of tears. As she sat weeping on the toilet, she heard the unmistakable sound of a cow's head thudding against the hard concrete. She vowed there and then that she'd leave the job and become a vegetarian. Selwyn banged on the door. "I thought this was a humane abattoir." "It is when Mervyn's here, but this is how I do things. Humane is for humans. Animals deserve no mercy." "You're the animal here. I'll tell Mervyn." "So who do you think you'll believe? His loyal right-hand man or Clara Winkleface, a girl with a surname that sounds a bit like a child's penis? Now, I have a chest wax at 5. Daisy still needs killing. She needs to be at the butcher by 6, or you won't get paid today." With that, Selwyn skipped away whistling "Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend." A moment later, Clara emerged from the toilet with a newfound resolve. Daisy had to have it, or the bailiffs would have her. She would just cover her eyes and slice. But as she lifted the knife, Daisy let out a very sad little moo. Clara peeped through her fingers and saw her big, brown, bovine eyes looking at her. Clara swore she saw tears. She immediately melted. In those eyes she saw more humanity than anyone had ever shown her. Humane is for humans, that's what Selwyn had said. And she was damned if she wasn't going to show this cow some humanity. Surely they wouldn't miss one, and this one was particularly lovely. Daisy was indeed dashing, and had turned the head of many a bull in the preceding years, even causing confusion and existential crises in some cows too, but that's another story. So that's how Clara ended up shoplifting a ton of raw mince from the supermarket and sending it to the local butcher in lieu of the minced cow, and taking Daisy home with her. She hadn't quite thought this through, but Clara often didn't think, like the time she threw that frisbee at her mother's head just to see what would happen. The next day was difficult for Clara. She'd managed to fake Daisy's death, but with Selwyn keeping a Mrs. Mangly eye, she had no choice but to slaughter a few cows. She decided that those who refused to return her affection when stroked should be the first to go, though she did pump them with an obscene amount of sleeping pills to numb the pain. Over lunch, however, she was racked with guilt. How could she possibly play God, deciding which cows should live or die? Luckily for her, Selwyn had to leave work early to go to a One Direction concert. So when she settled down to watch Countryfile that night, there were 8 cows in a lounge. Just before she went to bed, however, she noticed Selwyn had left a very angry message on her phone, not least because calling her meant he'd had to leave the concert before they'd sung "That's What Makes You Beautiful." Mervyn was apparently beside himself. The local butcher had cancelled his contract. The meat he'd received was being investigated in relation to a sudden bizarre wave of narcolepsy sweeping the town. Mervyn's business was in danger of folding, meaning he wouldn't be able to afford the round-the-clock care needed for his mother. "You better have a good explanation tomorrow and get that butcher back on board," Selwyn barked. That night in bed, which she had now started to share with Daisy, having developed a deeper affection for her, Clara's guilt increased. Things had gone far enough. Mervyn wanted nothing more but to help his mother. Clara knew what it was like to lose a mother, and now her actions could cause Mervyn to suffer the same fate, minus the frisbee. In trying to be humane, humans were suffering. Next morning, she was ready to face the music. She took Daisy on a lead with her for moral support, the only one who loved her. She didn't feel quite so brave, however, when Selwyn greeted her screaming, "You're fired!" brandishing empty sleeping tablet boxes in one hand, a phone in the other, about to call Mervyn. Clara began to crumble. Clara began to cry. She'd never pay her debts off now. Things couldn't get any worse. But at that moment, Daisy turned around and let out the most gigantic fart. The massive gust of hot air sent Selwyn reeling backwards, and he tripped and fell headfirst straight into the mincer, which unfortunately was still switched on. Clara looked on in horror as Selwyn came out the other end, much transformed. Clara slid to the floor and wept. Her life, it seemed, was over. Just then, Daisy kicked her. Clara thought she actually heard her talk. "Move," she said. Clara looked Daisy in the eye, and suddenly it hit her. Of course, this wasn't an accident. Daisy knew exactly what she was doing. She was trying to help her. She had shown her the way. So, moments later, she was packaging Selwyn's remains. Animals deserve no mercy after all, she whispered to Daisy as the courier took the packages to the butcher. For once, Clara was not guilt-ridden. She had no qualms about people tucking into Selwyn. He was the beast, and besides, he was already dead. It was to her akin to how fruitarians waited for fruit to fall from trees before they ate them. Selwyn had fallen, quite accidentally, from the tree of life. Chomping on his bits was no worse than munching on a fallen apple, right? She also realised she could save more cows as long as she found appropriate replacements. And it just so happened that such substitutes were easy to come by. McDonald's eaters, Burger King eaters, beef eaters. She was admittedly misguided on the latter substitute and could have saved herself a few trips to London had she received a better education. Nevertheless, in the mincer they all went. They were all animals that had already lost their souls as far as Clara was concerned. Clara's house was now beginning to resemble Noah's Ark, but Clara was like a pig in shit. Quite literally, she could no longer see her carpet for cowpat. She couldn't care less about the state of her house, however, because so far 27 cows had been saved, and astonishingly, when Mervyn returned, he believed her story. "I caught Selwyn red-handed replacing the meat with cheaper alternatives so he could sell ours for personal profit. He scarpered when I caught him. I think I heard him mention Acapulco," said Clara. "Well, good riddance to him, I say. Clara, you're a hero. I'm lucky to have found you." This was the first praise she'd received in her life. Clara was delighted. What's more, the meat began to get rather a name for itself. In fact, people couldn't get enough of Merv's meat, as it was now fondly called. Clara couldn't believe it. Not that they realised, but people absolutely loved the taste of human flesh. They even came from neighbouring towns to taste the amazing delicacy. Merv's meat was now associated with quality. Business was booming. The abattoir had completely transformed. Mervyn could afford top-quality care for his mother. Her health improved, except for a bout of bother with her varicose veins, and Clara received a pay rise. But after a while, the dark reality sank in. Human options became scarce, and she found herself having to kill a fellow vegetarian called Brian after their first dinner date at Forever Falafel. She justified his death because he wouldn't stop banging on about some other woman called Linda McCartney. But soon she felt remorse. There were also way too many cows in her house, and she suddenly realised it was beginning to resemble the type of battery farm she was now so against. Daisy was particularly disgruntled. Clara took this to mean that she needed to take a long, hard look at herself. Enough was enough. She stopped the killing, resigned from her job, much to Mervyn's dismay, and released the cows to the wild. As she said a tearful goodbye to Daisy, she noticed how quickly she galloped out of sight. After an intense period of mourning, Clara did manage to get herself a job working at Forever Falafel, but she noticed with alarm that people were still obsessed with Merv's meat, mesmerised by this new taste. Their little hot mouths salivated and drooled over it in supermarkets and restaurants everywhere. But how could this be? Surely its popularity should have waned by now. Was the abattoir somehow still producing the deadly brand? Clara had a crazy thought. What if it were actually the cows doing it? Yes, she was certain. It was her fault. She had created a herd of murderers. She had to put a stop to it. So for one final time, off she went to the abattoir to investigate. As she crept inside, to her horror, she saw that her hunch was absolutely right. Because there was Daisy, slobbering, her drool dripping from her mouth and a rather podgy leg sticking out of the mincer. Clara fell to her knees and pleaded, "Oh, Daisy, darling, what have you done? I'm so sorry. Mummy taught you badly." "Why are you talking to a cow?" Clara nearly jumped out of her skin as Mervyn appeared behind her. "Oh, Mervyn, I'm so sorry about the woman stuck in your mincer. It was Daisy, but I'm the one to blame. I have a confession." "Daisy?" Mervyn laughed. "This has nothing to do with Daisy. She's only a cow, you idiot. And you don't need to tell me anything. I've known all along. I watched you on the CCTV footage. But why punish such resourcefulness? All I had to do was keep quiet, and if anyone came sniffing, I had the CCTV as evidence. But now I'm afraid your time has come." "No, you can't. Think, what would your mother say if she could see you now?" "Absolutely nothing," Mervyn said, gesticulating to the leg sticking out of the mincer. Clara only just caught glimpse of the varicose veins before she puked her breakfast into the container holding Mervyn's mother's mince. Mervyn was now very cross. Clara had ruined the mince, and he had an order due in an hour. He advanced, picking up a shovel and raising it high above Clara's head. But Clara was brave. She picked up a meat cleaver. She was going to fight to the death. At this very moment of need, Clara noticed Daisy trotting towards her. She knew it. She was right all along. They did have a special bond. She would always be there when she needed her. It was a happy thought. It was also Clara's final thought, because it was then that Daisy kicked her in the tit, and she fell headfirst into the mincer. "Thanks, Daisy. I thought I was done for," said Mervyn. "No worries, babes," Daisy responded. "I could never stand her bloody snoring." So is there a moral lesson to be learned from poor Clara's fate? Thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not eat human flesh. I think perhaps it may be simpler than that. If your meat's turned bad, it might just kill you.